Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. My name is Maria Servold, and I'm the president of EPLA.
And I'm Emily Carrington, the executive director. And with us today, we have Dr. Elizabeth Fredericks, the assistant professor of English at Hillsdale College. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
We are so excited to have you. Today's episode is going to be a little different than what we have done so far, but I think this is a good beginning for just another way to look at pregnancy loss. Today, we are going to look at some poetry, Irish poetry, right, that's covering and addressing loss. So I really am not familiar with this sort of as a genre of poetry. And so maybe before we read this first poem, some just sort of introductory words of finding this and seeing this and sort of this emerging poetry and art form.
Yes, so I specialize particularly in British and Irish literature, mostly contemporary. And as a result, I had been working on a particular poet named Sinead Morrissey, and I was interested in the way she portrayed women's bodily experience in her poetry, which she does quite a lot in really interesting ways, particularly as a way of pushing back against any narratives that essentialize women or boil down female experience to something too narrow or too flattening. And part of what came through in that as well were she had a number of poems that were about pregnancy, but also within that, poetry about infertility, and also one particular poem that was about a miscarriage. And so I wound up working on that particular poem as part of this. It was a conference presentation that I'm still kind of working through as a larger project. And it stayed with me as such a remarkable poem. It's very beautiful. I sometimes use it with my students as an example of how to do a close reading because it's very short, it's very compact, and it's just intensely rich in meaning. So it's a good one to use just for poetic technique, but also the subject matter is so remarkable. And it is a rare one to find. I mean, I think that's one reason that this poem was so memorable to me the first time I read it, was I had encountered relatively few poems that actually dealt with miscarriage in any particular way or pregnancy loss. And so this one stood out, especially as such a personal narrative from Morrissey.
So, and this is a relatively recent poem when you talk about the history of poetry. So can you tell us a little bit more about like when it was written? And
Yes, it was published in her 2002 collection Between Here and There, and then it was reprinted in a recent new and selected poems in about 2016 or so. She's kind of a mid-career poet. Sinead Morrissey is Irish. She teaches at the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University Belfast. So she's still very active. Her most recent collection was, I believe, from 2018 or 2019.
And I think it's interesting. It's recent in terms of poetry. You know, 2002, we've talked a lot about on this podcast about sort of the narrative and the willingness to talk about pregnancy loss. And I would say 20 years ago is a long time ago.
I mean, we've talked about even since we incorporated in 2016, the conversation has changed. So to be, quote, that long ago, it doesn't feel that long ago, but the conversation was different.
I would say this was written at a time when at least sort of publicly, colloquially, among friends, things were definitely still very, very quiet. So I think that's really interesting. I want to move into just let's read the poem and listen, and we'll have some discussion then on what we see there.
All right. Stitches. There has been extravagance in speech, and every spilled, exploded word has been a stitch in a blanket made for an imaginary baby. The words went south where the sun was, but stayed hungry. A name came in the third month, a face followed, a hair type, a footprint, but the stitches showed. Imagination's cloth too coarsely woven for life to catch and cover stitching over. And then blood, inevitable, true, simple and strong enough to cut all falsehood through. Later, the screen said darkness, no spine, no heart, and the stitches came apart.
Yeah, that is lovely and very true. And that's something we've talked about, is the honesty of what a miscarriage is. And I think she conveys that there.
Yeah, and one thing that's striking about this poem, I mean, slightly nerdy for a moment on the formal side. Is
That's
that,
why you're here. You are the resident nerd.
So it's written, I know you only heard it and didn't see it, but it's written in 3 4-line stanzas. And you might have heard that the rhyme is pretty loose in those first 8 lines. It's kind of slant rhyme. It's very inexact. And it's in that final stanza where the reality of what's happening becomes visible, that suddenly the rhyme becomes really tight and really precise. You have true, through, heart, apart. And she just clinches it all together in that particular moment too. The way she works with form to capture the heartache of it, I think is fascinating.
Yes. Right. And that's sort of an idea that we've talked about, when you know you're pregnant, but it's like this, you have these ideas about what it is, you're coming up with these thoughts about it. It's all sort of imaginary in a sense, right? Because you don't see it. And then suddenly it's made very real when the loss happens.
Well, and I think this is my amateur poetry analysis here. But right, what is art if not for everyone? This sort of vagueness as it begins, and then it just becomes so clear and so, gut-wrenching and common and clear and specific, but also like all of a sudden, like it comes into view. And for me, like that then like is, I know, I've been there, I've seen it. The screen, like the screen is dark, like man, what a unified experience that so many women have had.
Yeah. And that image of the blanket is so remarkable too. This idea of something you're piecing together or stitching, crocheting, knitting, what have you. That's the running metaphor that runs through all of it, where, I love that line. She says, imagination's cloth too coarsely woven for life to catch and cover, stitching over. And it's this tension between the dream and then the reality that contrasts.
Well, and I think so many women talk about that idea, right? Like this first trimester, there's a real baby inside me, but I don't know what it is. I can't see it. I can't touch it. I love that sort of, that imagery. Can you read that first stanza again?
Yes. There has been extravagance in speech, and every spilled, exploded word has been a stitch in a blanket made for an imaginary baby. The words went south where the sun was, but stayed hungry.
Did she say ever, is this based on her own experience, do you know, or did she talk about that at all? I don't know.
So I haven't heard her in an interview discuss this explicitly, but it's in a larger sequence of poems where there are poems that deal with attempting to get pregnant again. And then when the speaker of the poem, who I assume has a close parallel with Morrissey herself, finally does learn she's pregnant, all of this kind of comes together. It's a whole sequence of poems about this. And she writes about it really remarkably, actually. But yeah. Yeah,
Emily and I have read many reflections of Miscarriage, but they're all, like blog posts or articles or what have you. And this is neat. You said you read it with students. I'm curious what students, how they react to it, given the topic.
Yeah, they're usually not too put off by it, actually. I think because they're college kids, it still feels like a pretty distant thing that they haven't necessarily encountered yet. Or if it's happened in their own family and it maybe hasn't been talked about a lot. Right. Which is one reason I like to show it to them, going that poetry can encompass everything. There's nothing it can't sort of pull in. And that one thing that's so attractive, one thing we talk about is the shortness of it. And they're impressed by the brevity, that it is so emotional in such a short space. This is the gift it gives us, is the compactness. But it gives you images. It gives you ways to describe things that feel indescribable. And given that a lot of what they see is maybe love poetry, it's nice for them to see there's a dimension other than that.
Yes, right.
One thing when I work with upper level students on this is to talk about, especially in Irish poetry, how long it took for women's issues to become, or how long it took even for women to be seen as valid poets in Ireland. And then by contrast, how long it took for things that were very particular to women's lives to become valid aesthetic subjects. And so this is one of those little advancements forward, little by little, that's made it more feasible. And without Stitches, you don't have, and Sinead Morrissey, you don't have later poets who've also addressed this, like a younger poet who's currently working is Doreen Nigriofa, who also writes extensively about her experiences with pregnancy, sometimes pregnancy loss, sometimes very challenging pregnancies, things like that. And they're very personal poems that are really remarkable. And so it has made room for this to kind of advance into the aesthetic realm.
Neat.
So how was this received in 2002, or, among both sort of academics as well as readers, right?
Yeah, this was a fairly early collection. So I don't know that it acquired a ton of attention in 2002 itself. I think it's gotten more attention as Morrissey has become a more and more visible poet. So at the time, yeah, reviews didn't necessarily pick out this particularly. There hasn't been a ton of scholarship on this poem or on other poems that deal with this particular topic. I think I've encountered about one book that actually does address it in the larger context of women writing about motherhood and pregnancy. There's one academic work that deals with that, but this was picked out to be read more recently. It was plucked out or identified by Poetry Ireland to be read on the radio by RTE, which is the Irish National Radio. So it's gotten more and more attention as time builds. I think in the interest in making this topic a more public one and giving women more freedom to speak about it has added to its prominence in the last few years, especially.
I mean, you just think of all the women who like have these feelings and maybe don't know how to express them, and then if they can like hear this on the radio, like I'm not the only one. Someone has felt the same way and has said it beautifully.
And Poetry Ireland and RTE tweeted an image of the poem as well. So you're going, there is this visibility that has come to it more recently.
How does this fit in with sort of the themes of Irish poetry? I don't know much. This is not a genre of poetry I know well. Tell me a little bit more about the genre itself and how this is sort of working in there.
I mean, it's a very large genre and with a lot going on. I think one thing that's fascinating about Stitches, where it fits into kind of the tradition of Irish poets more broadly, Irish poets do tend to be more formal. They like working within form, broadly speaking. And so she pulls on sort of recognizable techniques there. Like I said, in terms of Irish women's poetry, she's operating within a space that Irish poet Yvonne Boland helped carve out for women. Yvonne Boland was really prominent. She passed away in 2020. She's a very prominent Irish poet who, in her early work especially, wrote about how there was no space in the tradition for women, except as subjects of poem. There was no space of women writing about their own lives, particularly. And I mean, that's not to say there weren't Irish women poets, but they weren't writing about distinctively women's experiences. So Boland sort of carves out that space for women. She writes a lot of poems about motherhood. Famously, one of her early poems was called Night Feed, which was literally about getting up in the middle of the night to feed your baby. And so she makes that space for motherhood to be a valid aesthetic topic. And then Morrissey is pushing that farther by going, well, it's not just motherhood, it's also the loss of that dream of motherhood that is a valid aesthetic topic and fits within. There's a strong Irish tradition of kind of elegy or mourning poetry as well. And so this fits into that where, when you grieve something, you have a poem about it somehow, one way or another.
Right. The darkness, it seems like an appropriate outlet. I mean, sort of all of art kind of does, but it does lend itself towards that.
And I think the way in which poetry allows you to work with metaphor and imagery rather than just talk really like, here's the thing in clinical terms. They're often taking the clinical thing and going, what is the metaphor that actually captures what's truly happening here? Which can take us to another poem. This is an early poem by Michael Longley. So it's actually by a male poet. He's been married to the literary critic Edna Longley for over 50 years. They have several children, but when they were younger, they did have a miscarriage. And so this was quite early in his poetic career. And he wrote a very short, it's only 8 lines, poem. So 4 unrhymed couplets, and everything is just metaphors. The first 3 couplets are just metaphors where he's trying to capture what has happened. And I can read that one.
Yeah.
Miscarriage by Michael Longley. A stunned cabin boy steering your ship to the bottom, a flayed finger attached almost to the palm of her hand, a tea leaf washed from the rim of her cup, unembraceable, indisposable, my son or my daughter. As you have him searching there for a metaphor that will capture what has happened.
Yeah, I want to let's work through those metaphors. Sort of just carefully and systematically. Like what do we think he is, obviously that last line it he just sort of grasps for it, but let's just work through that beginning to end. And
so the first couplet is a stunned cabin boy steering your ship to the bottom. Just prevents that image. And I think that image of shipwreck, I think is the critical one, but it's not the captain, it's the cabin boy. It's the most inexperienced and most helpless person who might be on board a ship who's left steering it.
Is that himself?
I'm not sure. I mean, this one's a newer discovery for me. I don't do a lot of work on Longley. And this is a very early poem that he did publish it in a collection, but it's not in his most recent collected poems, where a collected poems is not a complete poems, as I have to always tell my students. So he left this one out. So yeah, but I think, I mean, it's this image of potentially the cowboy. I mean, he was fairly young when he wrote this. And so there is that sense of, I mean, and who's the you in this poem as well? It seems like that might be an address to the child.
It almost reminds me, I mean, it makes me think of the idea that women feel that we feel with the loss of our bodies not knowing what they're supposed to do. Like the cabin boy doesn't know what he's supposed to do,
Right.
you know, with the ship.
Right. Well, and I'm also thinking of that helplessness of the father who
Can't do anything to fix
can't
it.
do anything to fix it.
Yeah.
Is experiencing their own loss while also not being the sort of the subject or experiencer of the loss, right? But yet sort of in this fatherly, I'm supposed to guide and care for, and everything is coming undone, and I have no idea what's happening.
And the ship is sinking, and I am
yeah.
useless
Yeah.
in this
Right.
moment.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. If
Yeah,
it's
I
him
mean,
or
I
not.
think it is probably, but especially because the next two couplets both turn to a her, which seems so clearly to be the speaker's wife. Maybe go to the next one now.
Yeah.
So the second couplet is a flayed finger attached almost to the palm of her hand. Just like a shockingly gory image in some ways, very painful.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that one.
I mean, yeah, I don't either. But Elizabeth's here for our expert nerd. We said that, but there, I again, though you say shockingly gory, we've talked about this. Like miscarriage is shockingly gory.
Yeah, and I think he's trying to just knowing that like it's not his own experience, and so for him to talk about like women's internal organs and things like that might not be the appropriate thing. But there's blood, there's pain, there's horror. How do you capture that in an image from the outside?
Yeah.
And I think this idea of a flayed finger, so a finger with the skin stripped off, almost attached to the palm of her hand. And I think that sense of there's something that's been lost, that's part of you
Yeah.
that is
Right.
now not there. And the image of being flayed, I mean, every nerve ending exposed in that way as well. I think he acutely captures the idea of pain in that moment, especially because our hands are so sensitive.
Right.
And you can imagine getting a paper cut
Yeah.
and how painful that is. And then you go, a flayed, it's so much worse than the pain we're familiar with.
And maybe that's how he can think about it.
Well, and I think there's this strange, this is true in loss and this is true in pregnancy, right? Like they're part of you, but they're not part of you. You know, you're growing an entire human and an extra organ and, you know, like, to whom does any of this belong, you know?
And he's capturing the smallest, like if you're thinking about the child as the flayed finger, you know, it's attached almost so it's in the process of detaching in that moment. And it is just that small as well. I mean, so many of these images, after the first one, the images are very much about smallness, the tininess of this thing that is the child.
Yeah.
And that takes us to the third couplet. So a tea leaf washed from the rim of her cup. I think just the fragility.
Yeah. Like
of
the
that.
etherealness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's this thing that so quickly can disappear almost without you trying, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And then the final one, unembraceable, indisposable, my son or my daughter.
I think that just captures like what I've heard so many men, and I know women say too, you know, that it's escaped. There's nothing to hug or to hold. I know women have talked about, and I've experienced myself, like the aching, heavy arms. But I think that like it was literally a physical, like I'm missing something. But I think for men, I've heard, you know, my husband still carries around, I believe, the picture because it was the only touchable, tangible thing that sort of gave him some space. So this unembraceable
and indisposable at the same time.
That's so
it gives it
right next to
physicalness.
They're almost opposites though, right? It's
Yeah.
like a thing you can't let go of, but also you can't, you know.
Yeah, no, that's really good. You're
You
right.
simultaneously can't hold it and can't let it go.
Exactly.
And so the paradox there with those two words.
That's the word, paradox. Which is exactly how it feels too, right? Like
Right.
you're both all you want to do is keep it, but you can't, it's going. Yeah.
Yeah. There's another poet who's done something similar, and this one's a little distinct. And I have to first introduce it by saying this is a poet who usually writes in Irish.
Oh, wow.
So Nuala and Dhomhnaill. I do not have Irish. So
we have this in translation.
Neither do
Yes.
we. And I'm assuming most of our listeners do not.
Yes. I always feel a little bad because obviously, I mean, she writes and then other poets always translate her work. So it's usually presented in bilingual editions. But I will not attempt to read it in the original Irish, though it's very, very beautiful to hear it read. So this is the Irish poet, Nuala and Dhomhnaill, who's pretty close career-wise in terms of the timeline to Yvonne Boland. And is sort of working as well at that same time to expand that space. She has a poem from fairly, I think, early in her career. It's from a collection called Northern, which was a while ago, called Miscarriage Abroad, which I think picks up some of the same themes as the Longley, but does expand on them. I'll go ahead and read that one out. This is a translation by Ellen Naquillinen. Miscarriage Abroad. Your seed quickened inside me. I made you welcome unborn. I said I'd raise you carefully by the customs of my new home. The holy book under your pillow, bread and a needle in your crib, your father's shirt over you, and the sweeping brush at your head. My happiness was overflowing until at last the banks burst and outpoured a frog at 10 weeks, not what I dreamed would be. And now that March is here, and it is the proper time for you to be born, the white ribbons of the tide remind me of your swaddling, the long threads of a lazy seamstress. And I will not go to see the child newly born to my dear friend, for fear my envious eye might blight him with a look.
That hits on a lot of things we've talked about.
Yeah. Wow. Like that whole experience. There's a lot there, but let's talk about the line. The one that struck me the most was the what was it? Born 10 weeks like a frog.
Outpoured a frog at 10 weeks, not what I dreamed would be.
And again, I think this one thing we're seeing that I love, and I think poetry can do, right, is we've talked a lot about sort of how do we talk about miscarriage? Dignity matters. Women's dignity matters. The dignity of this child matters. Like, we care about dignity. We're not here to just talk about the gruesomeness, but that also there's something to give dignity. We have to be honest. We have to be prepared. We have to be true. I think there's a lot of room for dignity and truth in darkness and in honesty, and there's no room for dignity in shame. And when you sort of cover up things and feelings and don't bring them to light, and then we end up, and I don't want to get too distracted, but we end up then not affirming, truth. We end up brushing things away and far away. And I think that brings it out. Like, so, okay, so I'm talking about a tiny baby looking like a frog, and now I'm talking about dignity. But I think there is something shocking there, right? Like,
well, it's bringing dignity to the feeling of surprise and dismay, perhaps, at what you see.
Right. And that feeling of detachment, like, this doesn't look like a tiny baby.
It's not what I dreamed of.
It's not what I dreamed of.
And I think that's the disjunction
that
she's capturing there. It's not that the unborn child lacks dignity, but there's such a rupture. Yeah. Much like in the Sinead Morrissey poem, between the expectation, the dream, and then what actually happens. And to capture the shock of that. I think it's important she doesn't end there. That's in the middle of the poem, and she very carefully brackets that with 2 stanzas on either side, both that capture the preparation, but then what happens after. And strikingly, after that stanza, she turns to now addressing the child once again with the second person pronoun. She does that in the first 2. Your seat quickened inside me, the sweeping brush at your head. In that middle stanza where she does have outpoured a frog at 10 weeks, like that's not, she doesn't say that's you. That's what happens. Right. That's
perspective
the shock
shift there.
And then once we get out of that stanza, she goes back, now is the proper time for you to be born. The white ribbons on the tide remind me of your swaddling.
Right, which is just such a beautiful, gentle,
the
baby,
tenderness of it,
humanness.
I was very struck by the part about I will not go see my friend's baby,
Right.
which is, another thing we talk about, a feeling that it's okay if you feel that way. It's okay if you want to go see someone else's baby, but it's okay if you don't want to.
Well, and man, does this hold the 9 months,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the experience. So, right, you quickened inside of me. I found out I'm pregnant. We know we're pregnant. There's this joy and excitement, and I had plans for you, right?
And here's all the customs we're going to observe, right? These are obviously very personal things,
Right,
Your father's shirt over you,
Right.
Like the dream of that,
Right. We're gonna. There's just so much there, right? And everything that you do dream of as a mother, right? This is how we're gonna raise you. And then this moment, the miscarriage, and then the moment, and we've talked about this before. Then all of a sudden, 9 months later, or 6 months after the miscarriage, you sort of learn to survive for 5 to 7 months, whatever it was, and then there's this you're supposed to be here moment.
The date comes. Mm-hmm.
And then everyone has that friend that's having a baby
At the same time.
time.
Yeah.
And it's so painful and so confusing. And she just captures what I think is just such a universal experience there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to frame it as envy too, I think is that longing,
Yes.
right? It's not anger at the friend or anything like that. It's just the longing for what the speaker does not have that the friend does have. Like, I want the baby, and I don't want my envy to harm them. And that's why I stay away.
Right. And that's such a, back to that isolating experience of loss. Sometimes sort of feeling too, like either you're a cloud of sadness or this, the eye, she doesn't want how does she say it with her, the eyes of jealousy?
Yes, I will not go to see the child newly born to my dear friend for fear my envious eye might blight him with a look.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I think that's,
Very true.
It's very true. It's just it's such a true and good experience. Well, we are out of time for today. I think there's a lot of depth and richness there. Thank you so much. And I think that's a good place to to let things settle.
Is there a way to point people toward finding, if they're interested in reading more?
Yes. So Sinead Morrissey is the first poet we looked at, and her collection Parallax contains these poems as well as some others. You can kind of see that full sweep of experience in many ways. And that's pretty broadly available. She has a U.S. publisher, so that's easy to track down. The Michael Longley poem's a little harder, but he does have a lot of others. I would say the Nuala and Dhomhnaill is pretty easy to find because she also has an American publisher. Another good one that we didn't cover today that would be easy to track down here is a poem called The Stoic by Irish poet Paul Muldoon. Just another one about his experience of hearing about his wife's miscarriage from her when he's far away and she calls him to tell him. And that's from a 1992 collection of his. It's also, again, very easy to track down. So those are some ways to do that. These are all wonderful poets who also have a lot of other whole range of human experience to capture. But yeah, these haven't necessarily been collected together in any particular way, which is, something that should happen to pull these together. But yes.
I think there's an interesting opportunity there for more, not just study, but digging. These are so, what I hope we have done here and maybe start to do is make these accessible, right? Like poetry is for readers, not just for academics and English PhDs, right?
Yes.
And I think these are just such accessible. I know one of the frustrations I think sometimes getting into poetry is having the context and ability to understand
or not knowing where to start.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I was going to say
so
not knowing where to
much
start.
out there.
Yeah.
These are all wonderful poets to start with. I would say especially Morrissey. It's very easy to fall into her work. And like the other younger poet I mentioned, who also has a wonderful one called Awakening that's about a miscarriage. Doreen Nigriofa is another wonderful one who's very easy to sort of slide into, a very approachable poet.
Yeah, we'll include some of this information in the podcast,
maybe the names in the description.
Yes.
So if you
some
are
of these
really
names are hard to spell.
curious, and yes, go ahead and look back at the description. So, well, thank you so much.
Thank you
for
for having
joining
me.
us. This has been
was
a really
wonderful.
rich conversation. So,
Yes.
this
It reminded me how much I like poetry.
right. We'll have to keep visiting that. So, thank you very much. This has been an episode of Hope Blooms. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.